Thank you everyone for being here. It's easy to say that this is the most interesting project I've done because it's really incorporated all these different themes in my life that I've done for many years. One is meditation, one is technology, and one is music, and this has merged all three of them. I'll give a little bit of background on how I started the project, and what was interesting, and it's really heartwarming to be at NYU specifically, because the thing that the project started with a dream I had, and in the dream I was on an NYU campus. And so this is the actual journal entry from the dream. So it was late 2017, and I was at a mix between the NYU and Berkeley campus. So I've lived in Berkeley and I used to live in New York, so my brain put those two together. In the dream, I saw a woman I had given some of my recent songs to and the tracks I'd been making with a friend of mine. I knew in the dream she was a New York Times reviewer and a biologist. Totally fictional woman, just something my brain cooked up. I asked her what she thought of the music I gave her, and she replied, "Well, it's really not remarkable, is it?" In a blunt sort of way. And the person that's in here is my old advisor from school, who was quite blunt and a very important person in my life. I felt hurt but didn't show it. I walked away from the building where I saw her through campus. And I remember when I was walking through the campus, it was a mix between Berkeley and Washington Square Park. Brainstorming how to make the music more interesting to her specifically as a biologist. Then I wondered if there were patterns in human DNA that I could map to MIDI notes or rhythm patterns, and that would be a cool concept album. So I woke up and I was like, write this down right away before I forget it. And I Googled that same day. I went to NIH and found these DNA patterns in the chromosome. And I started to screenshot these, bring them over to Ableton, and make MIDI music sequences directly from human DNA. And right here on the page, that became the project name, Primary Assembly. So the EEG wasn't involved yet, and so for about a month and a half, I was making synthesizer sequences and drum sequences from human DNA patterns. Then I was just on Instagram. I wish it was a little more poetic or artistic than that, but I was literally woke up and was just going through Instagram, and I came across this ad, so thank you to the algorithms. I came across an ad for Choose Muse, which is the manufacturer of this device, and I think it's called Enter or Exxon. The actual company name's longer, but the Instagram account is Choose Muse. And I saw it, and I went to their site, and I wanted to see if they had an open API, if they had an iOS SDK, which is what I code in, Objective-C and Swift, and if it was Bluetooth. I just wanted to get the specs on it. And so this is where the other thread of creating this project comes from. So previous to this, in 2014, I built an iOS music sequencer that did generative algorithms, so making music with a generative system of code. And over time, I was getting the taps from the user, and I thought, well, why don't I grab the user taps as well and incorporate that into the generative sequences that I output? And after developing that and making it more sophisticated, I realized, I made an AI. So I made a machine that learns the musicians' patterns of what instruments they choose, what notes they choose, what pitches they choose, and then what gets generated out of the app is music that sounds like that specific musician. In that project, I built MIDI frameworks, a looping sequencer, audio frameworks. So I had all this code as a foundation. Then around 2016, I met a dancer in Berlin and started working with them where they would put on these wristbands. First I used Arduino boards, and then I used, I think, iPhone apps. So I went to Swift, and then I got something that was a little more durable, because the Arduino boards and the iPhone apps would go flying across the room pretty regularly as she was dancing. and the ones I end up using, they're called Myo, M-Y-O, and they are, yeah, no, they're great. Yeah, they're stretchable, yeah, and it can pick up on muscular movement. So I put on her arms and legs, and just the it had the same accelerometers as the Arduino and the iPhone. And in the course of that, I figured out a good Bluetooth framework. And what I was doing with the dancer was I was taking I've worked with several dancers, I was taking their motion data as it was coming in via Bluetooth into the iPhone, and then converting it to MIDI signals, which then could control a synthesizer or a drum machine. So it was going motion into music. So I was used to converting some sort of Bluetooth input into musical information, which could composition-wise and shaping the signal. So when this dream came up and then I saw the Muse, I already had the MIDI framework, I already had the Bluetooth framework, and I already had a version of data mapping from motion into music. And so when I got this, I got the EEG, it arrived in the mail, and within 36 hours I had a prototype where I had this, I put it on, I had it talking to the iPhone successfully, and a lot of the times I use a lightning to old school MIDI cable, and it was plugged right into my modular system. And when the modular system would receive a MIDI note, I would see a light go on. And so the idea was, can I trigger a single note with my brain, not touching the synth? Can I think something and make a light go on? So I put it on, powered up the app, everything was plugged in, and it was that first moment of like, and the light went on. It was just a complete eureka moment of like, I just played a key on a keyboard with my brain, like not touching anything. And that was the point where I realized, if I can make a single note, I can eventually make a full symphony, a full series of compositions. And since that moment, it's just been advancing the system and advancing the system and advancing the system. And typically, each time I use it and perform with it, I get a glimpse a little bit into the future of what the next steps are. And that's been the process of performing, having other people see it, having discussions with people who do similar work, and then the system evolves and I build that and I perform it. And that's been the process the last couple of years. This was the proof of concept. So it went from my head to the iOS app to the little light, and then today the signal flows. So it'll go from my head, it'll go to this iOS app, and then run into, today I'm using the laptop, it'll be triggering Ableton. I could easily, just as easily run it into, sometimes use the Octatrack, the Electron Octatrack as a sampler. I've also used it to trigger hardware synths. I've used a Waldorf Blofeld or Electron Analog 4. And I've done some tests where I plugged it into a Electron rhythm drum machine just to see what would happen and listening to some of the percussions that came from my brain. So then the laptop will go up the speakers. And then the other part of the signal flow has to do with a lightning port on an iPhone can send either video or MIDI, but can't send both. So I actually have a relay where the EEG data goes into the main iPhone and then relays it to this video projection iPhone. And what we'll see when I perform it is you'll see the live brainwaves, and it's coming off from the relay phone. I'm glad everyone understands that. It's always a tricky one to, it's like, wait, you're what? And that goes up the projector. You get into brainwaves a bit. Do you want me to discuss, are people familiar with the different brainwave ranges? Has anyone here worked with EEGs before? Awesome. I love doing these talks in rooms like this. It's like, we know all this. So some of the basics are, the lowest frequency is delta. And in my experience, delta goes up with stress response, like stimulation, or if someone were to say my name or tap my shoulder, my delta goes up. Theta is similar. It's also a stimulation one. The peaks aren't as high on theta, because delta also picks up on muscular changes. And so if someone were to say my name, as I'm turning to look, the muscles of my neck and my face are turning, and the EEG picks up on some of that muscular movement. Theta is more just inside the brain, and when there's a peak, it's the stimulation inside the brain. I'm going to skip alpha for a second. Beta and gamma are higher frequency waves, and even neuroscientists are trying to figure out exactly what activity will trigger which waves. The thing I've seen most remarkably is I once put this system on an opera singer, and normally during music performances, delta and alpha and theta are high, and beta and gamma are just kind of bounce along the bottom. When an opera singer put this system on, it was her beta and gamma at the top. So my theory from that is that beta and gamma have to do with breath and with language, because she was doing circular breathing and she was singing in German and Italian, and so her brain was processing other languages. Alpha is a really interesting wave because most of the waves, as they go up, it has to do with some sort of stimulation or increase in activity. Alpha waves are interesting because they're a suppressant, and when alpha waves go up, it actually suppresses stimulation, not just of the other waves, but of the senses in general. So if I'm in a noisy restaurant and I'm just trying to talk to Billy, my alpha waves will increase all around spatially around the rest of my head, and I'll just be focusing on him. My alpha waves will be low. So it's letting the stimulation in, but the rest of my brain, I'm tuning out the rest of the restaurant and the noise. And so alpha wave is a suppressant. Easiest way for alpha waves to go up is closing my eyes, moving into meditation, moving into a state where I'm tuning out the rest of the world, and going into, it feels like a subconscious space or a sort of dream space, and that raises my alpha. So I will perform briefly with the system, probably for 5 minutes or so. Are there any questions before I perform? Cover the basics.
I guess, how are you doing the mapping? What do you map it to?
Sure. So when the brain waves come in, I'm looking at a few different things. Initially, the idea was, do I take this brain wave and map it directly to, say, a filter, or map it to a volume? And I have done versions with that. With this particular version, 2 things. I'm looking at individual waves, but I'm also doing relational computations where I'm looking at where alpha is and where delta is in a particular moment, which one's higher, and by what percentage, given recent values. And that model gives me the best snapshot of the level of activation in my brain in a given moment. Am I in conscious, or am I in subconscious? And there's a few different mappings in this. I am controlling different high pass and low pass filters and able to shape the overall sound. So as the sound gets bassier or dreamier, we'll see with this particular system how that comes out. That's me going into alpha state. As the sound is brighter and has more notes coming out that are higher in pitch, that's my delta being higher. And delta is the stimulation area. The way that I'm triggering notes is as notes are going up and down, it's almost like a keyboard sideways, so it's hitting certain notes. I'm keeping them in scale, so it's not complete madness. So it's not like, but it's in a major scale, and I forget exactly which keys it's triggering. I think it's different per instrument. A lot of this work is not just the technical part, but making creative decisions. So the system sounds interesting. That was something that was important to me in the beginning. Was I don't want to put on the EEG and just hear because while that's novel, an early goal was to be able to perform this for at least an hour and do full, because I come from a techno world, and a live set is 45 minutes to an hour. I will not be doing that today. But I knew it had to be more aesthetic, more beautiful, more interesting than just tracking a tone to a brainwave. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no,
great.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions before Yes.
Well, you have a cell phone before a computer. Why not straight Bluetooth to the laptop as a purpose of?
Going through the phone?
Yeah.
I usually don't use the laptop. I usually use hardware. And so in terms of travel and shorter demos, I'll just use Ableton. But normally I use an Octatrack. I do have the Octatrack here if it makes sense to plug that in. Because the ultimate goal is to stay with hardware. During my motion sensor project, I had a number of instances where my signal chain was going through the computer, and the computer was always the thing I need to reboot, and it was being buggy. And in situations where, you know, I'm presenting it to someone for funding or, you know, to get a grant and I have to keep rebooting the computer, I was like, I can't keep doing this. And so I just found that the iPhone, it's more portable. I could, you know, bring a bunch of them at the same time. And they've been more consistent for me in terms of performance. They're more of a closed system, so, you know, I don't have, and often a number of the phones I use don't have any other apps on it except the ones that I'm connecting to, so the memory's full. Bye, Louise. Good to see you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll get started and then we'll have time for questions after the, yeah. of the things that's kind of a funny dynamic when I feel that the composition is coming to a close and I get ready to take off the EEG, which will cut the signal, my brain's like, wait, and starts to make more notes. And so that's what happened at the end. So I have to trick it. It's almost like, it's like my brain is like, I'm trying to like catch a cat that got out of the house. You know, I'm like, no, I'm not. You know, and so I put it up until my brain gets used to, and then I have to like pull it off quick before I realize it's gonna get signal cut. So that's what that was about. Any questions now that you've seen the system? I saw you going first.
Have you experienced like muscle memory?
What's that?
Muscle memory. In terms of like through many performances, like sort of repetitive motions that you might be doing, sort of.
Do I experience muscle memory?
Yeah. From like performing another instrument, where you sort of like, as you're sort of practicing it, sort of develop like a formal relationship to it. How does
Yes.
that work?
Yeah, I am developing a muscle memory to this instrument specifically. And the instrument, in a technical sense, is the EEG, but the one that I experience as the sphere of creation in the music is actually the brain, because it feels like a space. It feels like a sphere, and when I go into it, when I move through it, it feels like moving through fluid, and that it's not like playing keys on a keyboard or strumming a guitar, but it's moving a psychic type of body through this fluid, and the motions are very, it's like, instead of turning a car, which can be a sharp turn, it's like turning a boat. You know, there's a momentum and a physics to it, because the brain is an electrochemical organ with a lot of fluid in it. And so as the electricity moves through that fluid, that's what I feel when I'm composing, is moving those electrical patterns around. And they move with their own physics of motion. And as you saw the lines, you know, they're not like a square wave, they're very biomorphic, and that's my experience of composing with it, is these very biomorphic shapes and compositions that come out. In earlier versions of the system, I was composing more strictly to a quantized like 4/4 beat. You know? And if it is a situation where it's like a warehouse techno party, I will do that. But as I use the system more, it feels like my brain wants to make more. It's a new style of music for me that matches the source of it, which is brain electricity. And each time I use it, I do get more used to it. I get more skilled at being able to bring different waves up and down. And that's essentially the same as if someone gave me a guitar and I'd never seen a guitar before. It'd take me a while to figure out, you know, do I hit it, do I strum it, do I play a bow on it, you know? And that's what this system has allowed me to do, is slowly learn the brain as a new instrument. Yeah.
Also based on your answer to the previous question, would you say each wavelength is like divided equally in your mental efforts, or would you say you rather like focus on your description of the alpha more when you're performing?
The system is primarily using alpha and delta, and it uses a little bit of theta, and this one uses gamma and beta to a degree, and that's one of the limitations of the earlier builds of this, is that it's built specifically to me in my brain. And so as I put it on other people who have higher beta and gamma, it's not as responsive. I can hear when they put it on, and I see their beta and gamma being quite active. There's gaps in the algorithm, and so that's the goal, is to expand it where if I put it on, or you were to put it on, or anyone else in the room were to put on, it'd be responsive to their specific brain, and that I have a sense of just not even looking at the visual, but just hearing the sounds come out, have a sense of what their brain is doing. But yeah, that is one of the things right now, is it's quite tailored to alpha and delta as the primary composing elements, and that's because those are the ones that I learned to manipulate in my brain first.
do you have sort of like mental spaces in your head, like
Mhm.
that you travel from one to the other?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, sometimes it's quite physical
Mm.
in terms of like seeing movement. It's not that there's another representation of my body in it, but there is, it feels like a psychic entity moving around in the space. And it can move forward or back or drop down. Sometimes breathing and getting more into my body will affect things. Opening my eyes. This one's kind of interesting and creepy is, so when I look at one of the phones, and you know I have representations here on the table as well of the brain waves. If I look at the device and look at the waves and kind of zone out a little bit, all my waves drop. And that was one of the things I found first. Actually, the first prototype was clearing my brain by staring at a device. And it's interesting that how addicted these devices are. And in a way, it feels like it's a rest for our brain. But then as I've talked to other people, particularly people who are more in the, do you know transhumanism? Transhumanism is a philosophy that technology will improve the condition of the human experience, and through technology will evolve into a new species, particularly a type of cyborg type of species, and it will be distinctly non-human, and that will be an improvement. I'm not saying I think technology is quite dangerous too, so I'm not subscribing to that, but one of the ideas behind transhumanism is to be able to transfer consciousness into some sort of computer and then save it. So when the body dies, there's some continuation of consciousness. So what's interesting is when I'm looking at the device, sometimes my brain is still quite stimulated, but literally the electricity in my brain has dropped, and it feels like my consciousness goes into the device to a degree. It's just like putting my toe in the water. And when I'm looking at a phone, if I'm texting with someone or if I'm watching a film or something, I'm not in my body anymore. I'm in that conversation. I'm in that moving image. And so I think there's something to that of the electricity actually transferring into the device in a slight way, in a way where it's perceivable by the device. Yeah.
How is the feedback of the actual music that you're generating affected your ability to manipulate your brainwaves as well? Like, are you listening?
Yes.
To,
Yep.
like, how does that affect your performance?
So with this particular system, because alpha is so dominant, alpha goes up when I specifically hear music. And so if I get lost in my brain, or if I'm stressed out, if it's a kind of a high stress performance situation, I can go back to the music, and that becomes the anchor, and it starts to bring the music back into a range where I can compose the best. When the sound system is massive and I'm feeling the hits, the compression waves go through the air and hit my body, this really powerful biofeedback starts to happen, where my body is feeling what my brain is producing in the medium that my body's in, which is the space and the air. And in those instances, I've had really dramatic, ecstatic type of experiences where cause and effect start getting closer and closer. So brain sends a signal and that goes out. But when that signal is going back in, those two get really close, and it gets to this, almost feels like an infinity point in my consciousnness, and in a meditation sense, that can be a real intense experience. So during one performance last summer, it was a loud sound system, and I was at a large music festival. It was an hour-long performance, about 25 minutes, and in around 45 minutes, I started to weep because it was such an intense biofeedback experience, and it felt like my consciousness was overwhelmed in an ecstatic way, because I couldn't believe, my brain was struggling to believe that it was controlling the airwaves. I mean, this is like sci-fi, like comic book stuff, It's like, and so my brain so I cried. I want to get someone who hasn't asked first.
I'm curious if you've done this or thought about working with a collaborator, whether it seems like someone else might be able to different things in your brain as well, and whether that's like maybe there's potentially like a visual element that you're kind of responding to.
So would the collaborator be wearing the EEG and sending it? Or
That
any
could
sort
be
of
one
like,
model.
yeah.
The other could be like they're providing sort of what the stimulus that you're reacting to.
Yeah.
Or I'm just very curious how you experimented with how your brain reacts to things like
I've done a little bit of collaboration and had conversations about future collaborations. The one I did was actually with another musician, and so she was playing a synthesizer and running into the octatrack, and I was controlling the filters and effects on her signal. That performance was one of my least favorite because it was so distracting, and I didn't anticipate that. Other ideas of collaboration, I was speaking with someone in Canada yesterday who works with EEGs in Montreal. I think it's a system called DeepMind. It's an AI system as well. The idea of having multiple people wearing EEGs and seeing if, do the brains sync up? Do they start to harmonize together if everyone's hearing the same sound come out? And can they, through different types of manipulation in their own brain or allowing the system to impact them through the, the audio waves, the compression waves, do they start to have different synchronization? And as you add many more people into the same system, what are different ways to sonify or visualize that system in a way that's coherent so it's not complete chaos, but people still can influence and sync together. I'm trying to think of other collaboration ideas that have come up. I think that's the one that's come up a number of times, is having multiple people. Yeah. If you have ideas, I'm happy to hear them at any point. You had a question?
Yeah, just about the sonification part.
Yeah.
It seemed like today, right, you had like a set scale, maybe
Yep.
not.
I did.
But so like it didn't actually translate in terms of like, as you see like the more erratic waves versus like a tonal scale that's really set.
Yeah.
And just sort of what your process is for that. I know you said you just did one where you just control filters, but when you do sonify the whole thing, how are you sort of mapping that intention to
With this system, or the
Yeah.
times where I just do pure sonification?
Maybe pure sonification, like sort of what different ways you can explore that.
Yeah, so with this one, as the waves are going up and down, only certain notes are acceptable,
Yeah.
harmonically in this particular build. And so it's going down, it's gonna hit those and ignore those and then hit those, so they stay in a specific key and chord. I did a build for a system for a sound festival in Berlin, and I was using hardware synth, Waldorf Blofeld, and they had asked not for music composition, but a pure sound experiment, because it was a sound festival, and I was like, wait, music doesn't work at a sound festival? So apparently sound is sound and music is music, so it's a very German thing. There's very specific words for that too. And so I built one that was pure sonification. Most of the waves, and now we can get into this is a fun part. So on the frequency spectrum, brain waves are very, very low. They're right down, almost at 0 hertz. So 0.1 hertz, some delta waves are that low, so you can't get lower. Which is interesting that as we go up the frequency spectrum, I will get back to the sonification, but I want to show this. We get sound waves. So brain waves go up to about 44 hertz. Some of the gamma can get higher, but the bulk of the activity goes up to 44 hertz. Sound waves, we can hear about 20 hertz, so there's about 20 plus hertz of overlap. So the highest brain waves you can actually hear if you sonify them directly. And then we hear up to about 20 hertz, dogs can hear up to about 45, and then you have radio waves. And then interesting thing with the frequency spectrum. So if you take a brain wave at a specific frequency and jack it up like, 40 some octaves, you get color. There's a correspondence between sound and color. And the brain waves being underneath. So what I did to sonify the waves was I moved them up a few octaves and just mapped the activity of the brainwave directly to it wasn't the filter, it would be the tune of the oscillator. And I chose to put a number of effects, so instead of being like, it was more of a drone set, you know, with more aesthetics to it. And the activity of the brainwaves were shaping, you know, different filters and effects on top of it, but the core signal coming out, you know, as my delta went up, the lowest bassiest wave went up, and as my gamma went up, which is the highest wave, let's get back to, as the gamma went up, which would be the 30 to 44 hertz, the highest synth was going up and down. And that, while scientifically more accurate, intuitively didn't feel right. An important thing with this system is that when a sound comes out, I want that biofeedback reinforcement. So when my alpha goes up, and alpha, you know, is 8 to 12 hertz. When my alpha goes up, I have more bass sounds come out because it feels more like subconscious. It feels like I'm diving down into a dream state or a subconscious state. And delta, although it's technically the lowest, that would be this lowest sub bass coming out of a scientifically accurate system. Delta is a stimulated, stressed out wave. And so it didn't make sense to have this kind of lull of bass coming out when my brain was stressed. And so during that performance, it was just about 7 minutes. My brain kept getting confused because it was used to having an aesthetic reinforcement of the feeling, the psychic state from the sound. And that's an important creative decision I've made with this, is I found that I'm able to get into deeper meditative states or ecstatic states if I reinforce my psychic state with feedback from the sound. Yes?
I like how you're talking about, in this case, you put the subjective first as a way you design this, but can you also talked about how, you know, like, you get to a point and then, oh, you realize you've been prepared for this point, and then what's next is revealed, and then you get to that point and you realize, oh, well, what's next is based on this last bit, you know. Almost, I feel like that's like sort of like a guiding hand type of thing. Can you say anything about your worldview that kind of reinforces or kind of reveals that creative process? Does that make sense? Is there like...
I'm not quite following it yet. Can you
like
frame it in a different...
What's been your experience with that process? You know, do you feel like your creative process is something you like receive? Or,
oh, sure.
Yeah, does that make more sense?
I think so. Well, certainly having it come from the dream, in many ways it doesn't feel like something I cooked up. Yeah. It feels like something that was handed over by, you know, like the Greeks would describe a muse, you know, that would guide artists. It's been important to me to always have an aesthetic to it and it not be strictly an engineering project. And that's why, you know, programs like this are so interesting to me, that merge creativity with engineering, because a number of engineers could build this, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that was aesthetic or beautiful. And then I've met a lot of artists who are interested in this, but they don't know how to program it and get it working. You know, there are things like Max or Max for Live that you can do a bit of that, but what I prefer about doing my own code is really being able to tweak any level of granularity with it. Creatively in general, I feel that the things I've made that are best were from dreams or accidents or mistakes or just intuitive flashes. And I just happen to get credit for it because I was the person in the room or I was the person who had the dream. But in many ways, it doesn't feel like it was a logical, like, oh, I thought of this and then this cooked it. I mean, the fact that I was able to make the prototype so fast was stunning to me. that all those tools had already been ready. You know, it was like the thing with Karate Kid. Like I've been waxing some old car, and all of a sudden I'm like kicking ass in a karate tournament. I'm like, wait, how? You know, and that's how this feels. Where I was doing the things that interested me. I wasn't thinking, you know, 6 years ago, hey, I want to do something with an EEG and a brain project, and that will be the one project in my life that gets more attention than the rest of what I'm working on. It was, I'm doing the next thing in front of me because intuitively it feels right. And in a broader context, many ways, you know, I was doing really commercial web development type of work here in New York for years and remotely. And I just felt less and less interested in time, so I started to walk away from, you know, very lucrative jobs to explore things like making that AI sequencer and then working with the dancers. And it's built this whole life. I mean, it seems a little cliche, you know, like following my heart, but it's as simple as that. It's like, you know, following the creative intuition. Yeah. Did that get at what you were? Okay, cool. Good.
That's it.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you ever thought of mapping these brainwaves first to emotions? There's some theories out there like corresponding these to that before, and then so there's another interpretive layer before it becomes the filter image.
One of the things I haven't been able to distinguish with the EEG data, so the brain is electrical, but it's also chemical, it's electrochemical. And the EEG doesn't pick up on the chemicals. And so I've noticed being tired and being sad are similar, you know, because it's just low electricity. Being excited or being afraid would be similar. So I haven't been able, there may be in the EEG data, but I haven't been able to pick up yet on patterns that can distinguish mood. But that is something that I think is a curiosity for a lot of people. Is there some way to detect emotion and be able to incorporate that?
I'm interested in how distraction plays a role in your composing. Like, do you use it to your advantage? Do you find it as a hindrance? Yeah.
Totally. No, it's actually really important.
Are you easily distracted?
What's that?
Are you easily distracted?
When I get in a zone, I can be quite focused. You know, meditative zone. Usually the first few minutes of a performance are the most like, what's going on? And then I find my way and start being able to compose better. It's almost like tuning the instrument the first bit. But in terms of incorporating distraction, it's actually a core interest of mine in this project because, you know, I've done traditional electronic music and techno performances for decades. And, you know, if I'm performing off a drum machine and a synthesizer, it doesn't matter if I'm bored or super excited, having fun, really distracted. As long as I turn the knobs and hit play, the audience hears the same thing. And what it interests me with this particular system is being able to have my actual state be transmitted through the music. So every time I perform with this, it's going to be a different composition. And that's the core of a lot of the recent projects from the generative music to the dancers to this, is that I want the people who are hearing it, I want the music to be equally as new to me. So it's not something where I have this creative process alone in my studio, I make something I like, and then I present it to the world, but I'm already used to it. This is a system where as it's coming out, it's as live as possible. I mean, it's literally, you know, creating from the creative organ, which is the brain, in a live way. And so distraction is a part of that. That's part of that randomness of every day that is going to be incorporated in it. So it's very much a feature of the project. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering what was your relationship with meditation and mindful activity before you started this project?
Sure.
Lots have changed after working on it for some time.
That's a really good question. the first part of the question is easier to answer. I was talking to a journalist yesterday. He's like, "What's the hardest question?" It's that second one: is how have I changed? I can feel it, but I haven't been able to articulate it yet. Meditation-wise, I started meditating when I was 19, so it has always been something, throughout my adult life where I've used all sorts of different methods. I think they're all great, but being able to dive into my consciousness in a variety of situations, whether it's a classroom, being here in New York, I was actually downtown during 9/11, and I remember a friend of mine, we just didn't know what to do because the island was on fire and it was a very insane couple of days. And so we went to Washington Square Park and we meditated. And so to be able to sit and meditate while F-15s are flying over, and it was a powerful thing. Sometimes during this, when performing, I'll do something as simple as counting, or I'll do a body scan, or I'll do an activating meditation, and each one of those, there are tools I can shift from to manipulate the brain waves, either to go deeper into alpha, which is more of a relaxed subconscious state, or I'll do the activating meditation to raise the delta. And what's interesting about this system is normally when I meditate, I can go into an active meditation or a relaxing meditation, but my range is limited. With this, if I'm meditating and then the music then follows me, then my floor drops and then I can go deeper, and then it drops and I can. So I've been able to go much deeper and much further up than I would without this system. Just a normal meditation, my range is much more limited. The second question, I feel that the system is expanding my psychic sphere, for lack of a better term, particularly after I perform for a good amount of time. When I leave, it feels like my psychic sphere is broader, and actually don't bump into people because I can feel their energy further away. And so I just remember I did a performance in Iowa City, and afterwards it was a block party, and I just remember being able to weave through the crowd without hitting a single person. I was like, how am I doing this? It felt like some sort of Matrix type thing where I was just slicing through the crowd. I don't know, but again, I'm not far enough into the experience of it to have retrospective, wow, that's how it changed me. I'm just getting these, I'm experiencing it, but I don't know how to quite articulate it yet. So I'm glad that you asked that. Anything else?
All right, thank you so much, man.
Thank you for having me.
So amazing to hear. I'm sure there'll be much more questions. We'd love to have you come back by if you're ever in
Absolutely.
town,
I'd be happy
see what
to.
we're up to.
Yep.
Yeah.
If you ever need to reach out and want to ask more questions about it, my contact info, you can go to Primary Assembly or Instagram, or everything is Jason J. Snell. So that's feel free if something comes up, in a day or a week or whatever, or even if you have technical questions about if you're making something similar and interested in some of the technical aspects. I know we didn't show any code today, but I hope the kind of macro view of it was helpful in terms of constructing the overall project.
All right.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you again.